The AFN does not hold jurisdiction as the national government of First Nations peoples in Canada.
Tonight, at the Assembly of First Nations annual meeting, it's the youth voice that speaks the loudest.
The last assessment I got says that I owe $76,008.64.
On the hook for thousands of dollars, they thought they were tax exempt, but not according to Revenue Canada.
When did they realize that it was lost? Was it every time I came to the police station to go try and get my mom's pictures back?
And stories of lost police files at the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Good evening. Welcome to APTN National News. I'm Juanita Tautungi. It was the first full day of the annual Assembly of First Nations Special Chiefs meeting in Ottawa. Prime Minister Trudeau was absent from this year's assembly, but it wasn't short on government ministers speaking, and an announcement from the national chief about whether or not he's running again. As APTN's Todd Lamarand reports, it began as usual with the grand entry.
National Chief Perry Bellegarde spoke about unity and a slow but positive influence on federal policy, citing the government's support on implementing UNDRIP and the $11.8 billion committed in the last two budgets.
I believe our Closing the Gap agenda is driving many of the changes we're seeing in Ottawa. We put our priorities forward in 2015, right before the election. And now we see that work that we put there is starting to bear fruit.
However, Bellegarde said more work needs to be done on a new fiscal arrangement.
So let's talk about long-term sustainable, predictable funding for First Nations governments based on a percentage of GDP. Let's talk about equalization payments and revenue sharing. Let's talk about how we can benefit from all the lands and resource wealth of this country together. We need to have those conversations about generating revenue.
Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett agreed to the need for a new fiscal relationship and improved relations.
We are in a relationship, and the relationship is in a marriage, not a divorce. I really do believe that better is truly possible and that better is within our grasp.
Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould again repeated a government promise to move beyond the Indian Act.
The Indian Act cannot survive the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, for it is the antithesis of self-determination. So we need to move beyond it.
But it was Mark Hill, co-chair of the AFN's Youth Council, who expressed deep concern with the direction the national organization is headed, as its role becomes more of a government than an advocacy group.
The AFN does not hold jurisdiction as the national government of First Nations peoples in Canada. And the power and authority of our nationhood as First Nations peoples does not lie within the Assembly of First Nations, but rather relies within our languages, our ceremonies, and our cultures.
Bellegarde still wants the job, though.
If you ask me, will I be running? Of course I'll be running again. But it's up to the chiefs of Canada to make that determination who will be national chief, because they're the ones that vote.
Tomorrow we'll hear from Indigenous Services Minister Jane Philpott. She's scheduled to speak in the morning. Todd Lamarand, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Thousands of First Nations people are the target of some aggressive tactics over unpaid income taxes. The Canada Revenue Agency has been after many of them for years. Tonight, we hear from a few of the workers affected.
Ramona Dunn enjoys her time spent at home with their two pets. A home is something she's always wanted.
I've always wanted a home like this. The old, the century home, the old-fashioned charm. It's got a lot of character. I wanted to have a home so that when my boys and my grandson come to visit, they've got Grandma's place.
But Dunn is at risk of losing her dream home to the Canada Revenue Agency.
They have put a lien on my home, so that has really put me into a bind.
Dunn is on the hook for thousands of dollars in back taxes.
Right now, the last assessment I got says that I owe $76,008.64. This was back in March 6, 2017.
She was employed through an agency called OI Leasing, based out of Six Nations. It leased its status employees to businesses off reserve. According to OI Leasing, it meant that their employees would be tax exempt. Not so.
So now, like, with the way things stand is, okay, I have the disability tax credit that I can put towards my income tax payment every year, but it's probably just going to be enough money to pay for the interest and penalties that CRA puts against me every year. So I'm hoping, I'll find out next year, that it's going to be staying stable around the $76,000 and not increase the way it has.
To get by, Dunn has 2 part-time jobs.
I work part-time as a nurse, and I also work as a school bus driver. And between the two, I am just barely able to meet my expenses every month. I do find that as every year goes on, I am getting deeper and deeper into debt.
Dunn is not the only OI Leasing employee the CRA is after. There's about 4,000 others. Rachel Schilling has the same financial worries.
Well, I'm about to retire. I am leaving my job, and I make less than $40,000 a year. The government says I owe $650,000, and there's no way possible that I could ever pay that back.
Schilling moved to Toronto from Chaging First Nation. She says she had no choice.
When I left there were 6 people working full-time. The Indian agent, the police, the teacher, the public health nurse, and the Indian band administrator. And I knew that only one of those people were Native, and I knew that I would not stand a chance of working on my reserves. I had to move. I moved to Toronto.
So in 1993, Schilling started working at Anishinaabe Health in Toronto. That's when she became an OI Leasing employee.
They talk a lot about Section 87 of the Indian Act, and the Indian Act says that anyone who lives and works on reserve is tax exempt.
But it wasn't long before trouble over taxes began.
I worked for a Native organization. It was non-profit. I worked with Native people, for Native people, and they felt that was a good case that would go forward because there's so many people were in my situation.
Schilling's case won in the federal court, but the federal government appealed and she lost. Since then, she says she's lived with the stress for over 20 years with little support from Indigenous leadership.
In 1993, when we were protesting this, we had no support from AFN. Ovid Mercury was the Grand Chief, and there was no support from AFN.
Schilling says it's affected her whole life.
It meant that I could not look for careers outside the Native community. It meant that I had to, I did stay in Toronto. I worked with non-profit organizations working with and for Native people. Other people that I know who did move about, they had their bank accounts seized and their pay garnished. So it was a hardship for them.
15 hours north of Schilling in a coffee shop in Thunder Bay sits another OI employee. Tom Hawk worked for OI Leasing for about a year and a half in 2005. In 2007, he was notified by the CRA, and they took an aggressive approach 2 months ago.
I was really happy that they going off work on a Friday afternoon. I figured I'd leave early. I went to fill up gas on a reserve where I worked, and I found out that there was something wrong with my bank account. So I figured, well, I'd check in the morning, Saturday, and see what is happening. And then I find out here at the bank in Thunder Bay that CRA had frozen my bank account.
Hawk, who is about to retire with a debt of over $14,000, says it's a lot of stress to deal with.
I had relied on the old age security, CPP, and the guaranteed income supplement, to bring me up to a certain level. And that would keep me going. But if Canada Revenue is waiting there like a hawk, ready to grab me, what little money that would be coming, I don't know. It'd probably kill me.
After years of litigation in the courts, OI Leasing applied for a remission order with Revenue Canada. That was 5 years ago. We'll have that in part 2 tomorrow. Anna Francis, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Last month, APTN brought you the story of an incident between a Winnipeg cab driver and an elderly Cree woman. APTN has now learned the cab company has suspended the driver indefinitely with no chance of reemployment. Unicity Taxi says the driver's actions do not represent the company. Isla Garson says the incident has left her with a dislocated shoulder and a fractured collarbone. On November 19th, the senior jumped out of a moving cab after the driver attempted to drive away with her still in the vehicle. Unicity says there was confusion over payment, but says, quote, the driver did everything wrong, unquote. Winnipeg Police Service are investigating the incident and no charges have been laid yet. Time to take a break, and when we return, we'll take you to the second day of hearings into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Thunder Bay. First, here's a look at tomorrow's weather forecast beginning in the East Coast. Rain in Halifax reaching 11 degrees, rain in Charlottetown and 8. 0 across northern Quebec with snow in Inukjuak, Happy Valley, Goose Bay and Nain. A mix of rain and snow and 5 degrees in Gaspé tomorrow, a mix of sun and cloud and -1 in Quebec City. 2 degrees in Sarnia and Windsor, -3 in North Bay. 0 and cloudy in Ottawa. -4 in Kapuskasing, Timmins, Wawa and Sudbury, -7 and snow in Big Trout Lake. Sunny across northern Manitoba and cold reaching -19 in Churchill, -16 in Island Lake, -13 in Dauphin and Brandon. In Winnipeg tomorrow, -11. Sunny and -7 on the way for Saskatoon, -10 in Regina, -3 in Buffalo Narrows, -4 in Meadow Lake, and -16 in Stony Rapids. Welcome back. When an outside company wants to develop a project on your traditional territory, do you know your rights? Well, one group wants to make sure you do and developed an online resource to inform people of their rights to free, prior, and informed consent. Beverly Andrews has more.
Where do you turn when large-scale projects are being proposed in your backyard? Do you know what your rights are? What your community's rights are? If not, then Six Nations Polytechnic wants to help. The new free, prior, and informed consent website is an extensive resource.
Indigenous and allied scholars that came up with the plan to design this website to make sure that Indigenous communities were having access to all the right information in regards to any kind of resource development or governance issues that they may be having.
Developed in partnership with other research institutions, the site contains articles, toolkits, video, voice messages, and community stories to view and download.
Different levels of accessibility, from grassroots level community activists to other academics and other scholars and leaders, community leaders. And the idea really is all about trying to get as much information available to communities that are dealing with considerations of development on their lands.
Free, prior, and informed consent is the right for Indigenous communities to decide to support or oppose external activities such as resource extraction that would affect their territories.
Learning more, gaining the skills necessary to be able to deal with law, economy, politics, and then we have to decolonize a lot of our community attitudes.
The focus is on North and South American experiences, but the information can be applied to any project in the world. www.fpic.info brings information to the fingertips of the people directly impacted by development projects.
We have a responsibility to each other, not just our little own backyard, as a little own reserve. we really have to learn from each other.
Knowing your rights can help engage in meaningful consultation and discussion of impacts from a project, both negative and positive. Beverly Andrews, APTN National News, Six Nations of the Grand River.
The inquiry into relations between Indigenous peoples and certain public service in Quebec is in its final week of hearings for 2017. University of Alberta law professor Val Napoleon is presenting her work at the Commission over 3 days this week. She is convinced that legal traditions of First Nations must be acknowledged, respected, and brought into use before real reconciliation can happen between all people in Canada. She's now working on establishing an Indigenous law program.
So the program itself, we're looking at, it's 4 years. We're imagining 24 students a year, and it's comparatively teaching Indigenous law and Canadian common law. The intent is to have students be able to work fluidly between different legal orders, being able to draw on the resources from different legal orders in order to solve problems.
Stay with us. More APTN National News after the break. Here's the rest of your Wednesday forecast. In Fort Chip, you'll get to -9 under sunny skies, -2 in high level. 2 degrees in Edmonton, Red Deer and Medicine Hat, 6 degrees in Calgary. In BC, Kamloops will get a daytime high of -1, Bella Coola, 2 degrees and 8 degrees in Campbell River. Sandspit, cloudy and 8, sunny and 6 degrees in Fort St. John. -14 in Beaver Creek and Old Crow, 4 degrees in Whitehorse. Sunny and 3 in Samba Cay, formerly Trout Lake, sunny and -5 in Fort Simpson. A chilly -22 in Sax Harbor, not as cold in Delaney, -7 on the way. Western and central Nunavut are dipping into the -20s with -23 in Akvet and -24 in Nauyat, formerly Repulse Bay. Not as cold in some parts of the Baffin region, only -6 in Iqaluit and Pangnaktuk, -10 in Kingate, Cape Dorset. The Canadian Rangers are a unique, mostly Indigenous part of the armed forces. They patrol the north and reinforce Arctic sovereignty. Yet they don't receive the same entitlement as other Army reservists. On Tuesday, the Armed Forces Ombudsman released a report about this and more, and he joins me from Ottawa. Mr. Wellborn, thank you for joining us. What did your report find?
Well, you know, it's rather large. We had narrowly focused what we wanted to look at when we went into the report, and it was mostly about health care entitlements and the accessibility to those services. What we found, you know, there's been one of the things that we picked on very quickly was policy. We found a lot of ambiguity in policy. Where in some policy for the reserves, which the Rangers are a part of the reserves, they would be mentioned, and in other policies they weren't mentioned. So that ambiguity was a bit of an issue for us. We've tagged that back to the department. We also found that access to both physical and mental health services can be a challenge. Well, I'm sure anyone north of 60 could speak to that without me doing a report. But again, it does provide some unique challenges for the Rangers when they find themselves in those types of predicaments. The third thing we found was the underreporting of accidents and injuries as they happened. Many reasons for that. Sometimes the member doesn't want to come forward because they think the injury is not that severe, but you know, as we know, those things can manifest later. That was another one. And finally, we've recommended to the department that they develop a place where all the benefits and services that are available to the Rangers would be found in one location. And we also encourage the use of multiple languages to make sure we're getting the broadest reach we can.
And your report mentions a lack of staffing as an issue. Can you explain why? One
of the bigger issues when we look at, you know, if we look at ambiguity in policy, we look at report of accidents not being done. It comes down to, I think there's a fundamental issue there where the Canadian Ranger instructors, those are the people who are responsible for those Ranger troops, there's not enough of them. You know, the ratio can be as high as 53 to 1 supervisor in one location. So that is a major concern, and I think having enough Ranger instructors will allow those folks to do the job of educating and explaining to the members, the Rangers, what they are entitled to. So that is one of the issues.
And so what are some of the recommendations that your report makes?
Well, the recommendations we've made is we want to see the policy cleared up. We want to see the ambiguity taken out of the policy so that it's very clear. We encourage the Canadian Armed Forces as much as possible to publish in as many languages as possible. And we encourage the Canadian Armed Forces to find as many platforms to get this information to the Rangers. We also make a recommendation, again, I already mentioned, that they build one common platform where everything can be available for review. And we've asked that also that the department, in their review of the health services available to the Rangers, that they work in collaboration with the Ranger units and to come up with some feasible ideas of moving forward and how that these services can be brought to the people in place. Because one of the things we found is when there is an illness or an injury, there is reluctance on behalf of the Rangers at times to go south for that type of treatment. So I'd like to see the department working into that void to see if there's something that could be done.
And just lastly, Mr. Melbourne, how has the Minister of National Defence reacted to the report?
I received a notification from the Minister this morning. He has accepted the report and he's turned it over to the Canadian Army, and we've got a full acceptance from the Canadian Army, and they are working to implement the recommendations as we speak. So I'm very, very pleased with the response from the Army.
All right, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
You're more than welcome. Thank you.
And we would like to hear what you have to say about this or any other story. Here's how to contact us. Send an email to news@aptn.ca, like our APTN National News Facebook page, follow us on Twitter @APTN News, or go to our website, aptnnews.ca. Canada's Auditor General says Yukon is not doing a good job on climate change. Today's audit report says Yukon's climate has risen by 3 degrees since 1990. The audit looked at 4 Yukon government departments. The Yukon government has committed to reducing their carbon footprint. However, the auditor says they are not organized and not doing enough to make a difference.
Either the departments did not meet many of the government's 12 targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or they were unable to measure their progress against those targets. The departments need to turn their commitments into concrete action to successfully adapt to the impacts of climate change and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
That's all the time we have for APTN National News tonight. Do stay tuned. Face to Face is next. Dennis Ward speaks with Tim Fontaine, the writer who entertains the news of the day. It's all online on The Walking Eagle. Thank you for watching. I'm Juanita Tautungi. Have a great evening.